Hello everybody, my name is Ryan. Welcome to lesson 33 of learning HTML and CSS. In this lesson we'll be learning how to position objects on the page using CSS. So I have in front of me a page with a heading, a whole lot of paragraphs, everything inside of a wrapper which has a light grey background, and this wrapper is 800 pixels wide and its margin is set to auto, which allows it to center the whole block. Most websites have this kind of layout. So let's look at the code. You'll see the wrapper in the CSS, just the background color. I've reduced the width and I've set the margin to auto. Then in the HTML I have a div with an ID of wrapper which ends right at the end, and all the content is between this opening div and closing div, a heading with several paragraphs. I've deliberately picked a lot of content so that the page will scroll. And so now we'll look at the CSS on W3 Schools. Under the basic box category, there's a property called position. And this allows you to change how an object is positioned. So it has four possible values: static, absolute, fixed, and relative. The last two are not fully compatible. So by default, every element on the page is positioned statically. What this means is every element just occurs in the normal document flow, and it occurs in the order that you specified in the HTML code. So because we've put the heading first and then the paragraph, that's the order in which it will appear. Those are all statically positioned elements. Okay, so I'm going to start by showing you how to position something at fixed coordinates. So we say create a div. Doesn't have to be a div, it could be an image, it could be anything on the page, and I'm going to give it an ID of fixed, and then I'm going to just put some content in here, and in the CSS I'm going to say fixed. I'll give it a width and a height, and I'll just set the background to yellow. Now, before I show you what fixed positioning looks like, let's just see how it looks statically positioned. So there's the yellow block. Statically positioned, remember, is the default, and it occurs in the order of the normal document flow, in this case after the heading and before the first paragraph. So after the heading and before the first paragraph. Okay, so now we're going to change this to be positioned fixed, and you'll immediately see what happens. It takes this block outside of the normal document flow, and you'll see it's acting now as a layer hovering above the other content on the page. Some other properties now that we need to use also under this category of the basic box properties. We have four properties. The first one is left and right, top and bottom. So this has to do with the X and the Y axis of how we're moving this object on the page. Typically you would only set two of the four, one on the X axis, one on the Y axis. So that would be top for the Y axis and left for the X axis. Or you could use top and right, or you could use bottom and left, or bottom and right. So if I said 100 pixels from the top and 200 pixels from the left, it should position that box at those coordinates. There it is, 100 from the top, 200 from the left. It's always from the top left hand corner of the browser when we're using top and left. If I change this to right, it will obviously be from the top right hand corner of the browser. Okay, now what you should notice about something that's fixed positioned is that it stays stationary when you scroll, which is quite a nice effect. It's very useful for any kind of pop-up layer that you want to create, pop-up window or something like that. Alright, let's now look at relatively positioned objects. I'll just copy this and paste it somewhere here, and I'll change it to relative. And I'll just copy and paste the CSS as well, change that to relative, change the background color. I'm going to remove the positioning again just so you can see what it looks like before we do any change to the positioning. By default it will be statically positioned, so it's in the normal document flow after the first paragraph, because that's where it is in the normal document flow. But as soon as we change it to relative positioning still is still going to be in the document flow, in the normal document flow, but we can control the positioning. I'll just leave that out for now, just set the positioning to relative, and you'll see that nothing actually changes, except now it's actually a little bit above the yellow layer, so it's acting as a layer now, but it's still within the normal document flow at its normal coordinates. This would be the same thing as saying left 0 and top 0. Normally this would be relative to the top left hand corner of the browser, but because we're using relative positioning, it's just relative to where it was positioned previously, which is exactly there. So we're not moving from where we are. But as soon as I say a number other than 0, that should move it 50 pixels to the right of where it was previously. So now it's over there. If I use a negative number, it will move it 50 pixels to the left of where it was previously, which is now outside of the wrapper. And if I use a positive number on the top, it should move it down by that number of pixels from where it was previously. And of course a negative number will do the same thing, but it will move it left instead of right, or should I say up instead of down. So that's a relatively positioned element, but you'll notice that the spacing was preserved. So there's still this gap here of where this element used to be. So then this is now still maintaining the document flow, whereas the fixed positioned element was completely removed from the document flow. Okay, so the next thing is something that's absolutely positioned. So we'll just create another div for that. Now, absolutely positioned elements are very similar to fixed positioned elements, except they're a little bit more complicated. So let's start with the basics. With no positioning, it's obviously going to be statically positioned. So let's try this. There it is. As soon as I give it an absolute position, it becomes relative to whatever its non-statically positioned parent is. Okay, that's a little confusing, but we'll explain it now. If I say left 0, top 0, we first need to figure out what is its non-statically positioned parent. So there it is, there's the div. Okay, its direct parent is actually the wrapper. But the wrapper is not positioned with any fancy positioning, it's actually just statically positioned. And remember, the definition is it will position an absolutely positioned element relative to its first non-statically positioned parent. So there aren't any non-statically positioned parents, which means it will just be according to the body tag, which is the top left-hand corner of the browser. So there we have it. At 0, 0, 0 from the top, 0 from the left. It's in the exact left-hand corner of the browser. Notice that when you scroll, the scrolling, it moves with the page, whereas the fixed, it stays static. So that's the main difference between fixed and absolute. They're both taken from the normal document flow, but absolute is absolute according to the browser, whereas fixed is, as you scroll, it just stays static. Okay, now something strange starts happening when we make the parent non-statically positioned. So the wrapper is the parent. So if I set the wrapper to a relative position, that shouldn't move because I haven't set the left or the right, so it's relative to where it was, it's going to stay exactly the same. But notice now that the absolutely positioned block is no longer positioned according to the top left hand corner of the browser, the body tag. It's now positioned according to the top left hand corner of the wrapper, because the wrapper is now no longer statically positioned. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a very nice feature. If I want to put this in the top right hand corner of the wrapper, I would just use right instead of left for the x-axis. Set it to 0, which will put it here. Remember, if I change the wrapper back to a statically positioned element, this green box will be in the top right hand corner of the browser. Okay, remember this wasted space here is from the relatively positioned element, not from the fixed or the absolutely positioned element. So a big difference between relative and fixed and absolute is that the relative still maintains normal document flow. The space that it used to take up is still there, whereas fixed and absolute is completely removed from the normal document flow. So even if I have to take this coding and move it somewhere else, essentially changing the document flow, it's not going to change anything because the CSS has removed it from the normal document flow. However, if I have to move the div that's relatively positioned in terms of the HTML coding, currently it occurs in terms of the document flow, it occurs after the first paragraph. But if I have to cut that and move it after the second paragraph, because it's relatively positioned, it still maintains its document flow. So now you see the space that it was taking up has moved to after the second paragraph. I can still move it as a layer into different positions, but that space is still going to be available. Okay, so last thing with positioning is the z-axis, or what we call the z-index. And this z-index allows you to control the order of your layers. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to create another fixed layer. I'll just call it fixed 2. And then I'll copy and paste the CSS. I'm just going to make these layers overlap each other. So I'll just change the color to something different. Let's use orange. And I'll just make it 150 and 250. So now they should kind of overlap each other. They're both fixed, which means they removed from the normal document flow. Okay, at this stage I can't see the other layer, so just double check my top and my left. Oh, we need to call this fix 2. Can't have two things with the same ID. Okay, so now you can see them overlapping each other. But why is the orange layer above the yellow layer? Simply because that's the order in which I did it. I did the orange layer after I did the yellow layer. That's why it's occurring above it. But if I change the Z index, let's say I make it 10, and I also add a Z index here and I make it 5, the block with the larger Z index will be at the front. So in this case, the orange block will still remain above the yellow block. Nothing's changed there. But as soon as I increase this number above this number, 15 is larger than 10, the blocks will swap round in terms of the order. So this allows us to control the order of the layers. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. I mean, you could have a negative number if you wanted to, or you could have 100 or 2000 if you wanted to. The point is that whatever the larger of the two numbers is, that will be the layer that gets the positioned at the top. And I could even insert other layers now in between these two layers by making the other layer 12 or 13 and so on. And so ends our lesson in working with positioning in CSS.